Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
They say you always remember the moment your heart breaks, not like in the movies, where it shatters all at once with dramatic music in the background, but in real life it's quiet. Subtle. It's just a few words, or a picture, or a casual comment that hits so hard it knocks the wind out of you. For me, it was a goddamn Instagram post. I wasn't even looking for it. I wasn't snooping or suspecting anything weird. I was just mindlessly scrolling, half watching a rerun of Law and Order, when I saw my cousin Megan had tagged my sister Melissa in a story. Just one of those little innocent things, 2 beach chairs, 1 margarita glass, and the caption, sun, sand, and family, Christmas in paradise. At first, I didn't even think. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe Melissa went on a trip with her in-laws. Maybe it was just her and Doug getting away. But then another tag popped up. My mom. Then my dad. Then the whole damn crew. All standing in front of some luxury beachfront condo in Florida with matching Santa hats and shirts that said, "Merry and bright in the Sunshine State." That was the moment my heart didn't just break, it sort of folded in on itself. I stared at the screen for a good 30 seconds before I even registered what I was seeing. Everyone. Literally every single member of my family, except me. No one had said a single word. No text, no call, not even one of those fake, half-assed, wish you were here postcards. I wasn't just left out. I was erased. I left. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes the only thing you can do when you're slapped in the face by your own blood is laugh like you've lost your damn mind. Then the anger set in. That slow, hot, buzzing feeling that starts behind your eyes and crawls into your jaw. I called my mom. I didn't even think about it. I just hit dial. She picked up on the second ring, all chipper and sugary like she'd just stepped out of a Hallmark commercial. Well, hello, sweetheart. Everything okay? I didn't even say hello. So, was I just not invited? There was a pause. A long, uncomfortable silence that told me she wasn't surprised I'd found out, only surprised it had taken me this long. "Oh, Lori, honey, don't make this a thing." That was her first sentence. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "We should have talked to you." Just a condescending plea to not make it a thing. I felt my stomach turn. "You all went to Florida without even telling me," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "You didn't think I'd notice?" "Well," she sighed, and I swear I could hear her rolling her eyes through the phone, "we figured you wouldn't want to come anyway. You always say the holidays stress you out. And last Christmas, you got upset over the table arrangement, and your father said, my father said what?" I snapped. That maybe it'd just be easier if we did something smaller this year. More peaceful. I could feel my fingers curling around the phone like I might snap it in half. "So you decided to exclude me? Quietly book a whole vacation and just leave me behind like some stray cat you forgot to feed?" She hesitated again. "Lori, don't be so dramatic. This is exactly the kind of reaction we were trying to avoid." There it was. The magic phrase. Too dramatic. It was her go-to weapon, the phrase she'd used my whole damn life every time I called out their bullshit. I used to believe it. Used to think I really was too much, too intense, too sensitive. But not anymore. I hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I didn't beg for an explanation. I just let the silence answer her for me. Because the truth was, nothing I said could hurt her more than knowing she didn't break me this time. I sat on my couch that night in the dim light of my living room, staring at my tiny artificial tree, the same one I'd used for 6 years because I couldn't be bothered to replace it. It looked so damn pathetic, flickering half-heartedly in the corner like it knew it had been abandoned too. I opened a bottle of cheap red wine and toasted the empty air. "Here's to being the family disgrace," I muttered. "At least I've got the dog." My Labrador, Scout, thumped his tail against the floor and stared at me like I was the only person in the world that mattered. Maybe I was, at least to him. And then, just as I was about to turn off my phone and spiral into a good, solid, self-loathing binge, it buzzed. A text from Uncle Jeff. "I didn't go either. Call me tomorrow. We need to talk." Something about that message made my spine go cold. I hadn't even realized he wasn't in those beach photos. I'd been so focused on my parents and Melissa, I didn't even notice the one person in my family who had never once made me feel like garbage wasn't there either. I stared at that text for a long time, heart pounding again, but for a different reason now. Because if Uncle Jeff didn't go, that meant he knew something. And suddenly, I wasn't just the excluded one anymore. I was the one about to find out why. I woke up the next morning with a stiff neck, a half-empty bottle of wine on the coffee table, and a pit of something heavy sitting right behind my ribs. Not sadness, not anymore, something sharper, something colder, something like the kind of rage that doesn't explode, but simmers under the surface until it finds a crack to boil over through. I kept thinking about my mom's voice, syrupy and smug through the phone, brushing me off like I was the problem, like I'd always been the problem. It wasn't even about the damn vacation anymore. It was the confirmation of something I'd tried for years not to believe. Maybe they never really wanted me around in the first place. By the time Uncle Jeff knocked on my door around noon, I'd already convinced myself I was imagining things, or exaggerating again, or being that dramatic daughter they all whispered about during holiday dinners. But when I opened the door and saw the look on his face, that last flicker of hope inside me died a quiet death. Jeff wasn't smiling. He wasn't holding some half-hearted, "I'm sorry" gift basket or wearing one of those guilty expressions people wear when they're about to lie to you to make you feel better. He just stepped inside, pulled off his coat, and said, "You want the truth, or do you want the version they've been feeding you for years?" I didn't answer right away. I just gestured toward the couch and sat down across from him, suddenly feeling very small in my own living room. Scout climbed up next to me and put his head in my lap like he already knew I was about to get my heart kicked around again. Jeff rubbed his hands together like he was trying to warm them, but I could tell it was just nervous energy. "They didn't invite you, Lori. Not by accident. Not because they forgot. It was deliberate." I swallowed hard. "Yeah, I figured that much." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You don't understand. Your mom told everyone, including me, that it was best you spent the holidays alone this year. That you needed space. She said you were emotionally exhausting. That every time you showed up, it turned into chaos. And your sister, well, she called you a liability." I stared at him, completely frozen in place. "A liability?" "Her exact words," he said. "She said you're too intense, too sensitive, too unpredictable. Said it was about protecting everyone's peace." I laughed again, but this time it came out bitter and broken, like the sound you make when there's nothing else left to do but pretend it doesn't hurt. "So I'm some kind of holiday cancer now?" Jeff leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes soft with something like guilt. "I didn't go because I couldn't stomach it, Lori. I told them it was wrong. Your mom said I was enabling you, that I was just making things worse by feeding into your narratives." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. I wanted to go back in time and shake every version of myself that ever believed I was the problem. Every time I apologized for being too emotional. Every time I second-guessed myself after family dinners, wondering if I'd said the wrong thing or laughed too loud or asked too many damn questions. Every time I swallowed my pride to keep the peace in a family that clearly didn't care whether I was at the table or 6 states away. "So what now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Do I send them a thank you card for finally confirming I'm the family scapegoat?" Jeff sighed. "I don't know what to tell you, kid. I just thought you deserved to hear it from someone who wasn't afraid to say it to your face." He didn't stay much longer after that. We hugged at the door, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone in my family actually saw me, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who'd been quietly bleeding under the surface while everyone else passed around the gravy boat and toasted to family unity. After he left, I sat on the couch again, stunned and hollowed out, letting the weight of it all press against my ribs like a fist that wouldn't unclench. It was like discovering you'd been living in a house full of mirrors, only to find out every single reflection was warped. And then it happened. Just as I was about to retreat into another bottle of wine and avoid the world for the next 48 hours, I checked the mailbox. I wasn't expecting anything, maybe some junk mail or a late utility bill. But there it was, an envelope, white and crumpled, with my sister's handwriting on the front. My name scrawled across it like an afterthought. No return address. No explanation. I held it in my hand for a moment, heart thudding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I almost didn't open it. Part of me wanted to throw it straight into the trash and let whatever poison it contained rot in silence. But something about it felt strange, like it wasn't meant for me. Like it was sent by mistake. So I brought it inside, sat down at the table, and stared at it under the soft yellow light of the kitchen pendant. Just an ordinary envelope, ordinary paper. But I could feel it, whatever was inside. It was going to hurt. It was going to change everything. I wasn't ready for it, but I also couldn't ignore it. I slid my finger under the flap, slowly tearing it open. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The paper was smooth beneath my fingertips, but the words scrawled across it were jagged enough to cut me in half. The moment I unfolded that letter, I knew without a single doubt in my mind that I was never meant to see it. It wasn't written for my eyes, wasn't meant for my heart to absorb, wasn't crafted with any shred of care or respect. It was a snapshot of truth, the ugly, raw, unvarnished truth that had always simmered beneath the surface of family dinners and birthday cakes and fake smiles posed for holiday cards. The handwriting was unmistakably Melissa's, her looping letters always exaggerated like she wanted every word to scream louder than necessary. I started reading slowly, almost cautiously, as if somehow going slower might soften the blow. But there was no easing into it, no gentle introduction or preamble, just venom, pure and unapologetic. Mom, I'm telling you now, we cannot invite Lori this year. I know you feel guilty, but she's just too much. Every time she's around, it's drama, tension, and emotional landmines. She ruins everything. I blinked at the words, reading them twice to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. My throat tightened and a hot pulse of anger flickered beneath my skin. It was one thing to be excluded. It was another thing entirely to see that exclusion laid out in ink, premeditated and dissected like some kind of strategic operation. They didn't just forget about me. They planned around me. They orchestrated it. She made last Christmas miserable for everyone, the letter continued. Remember how she flipped out over the table seating? Or how she got passive-aggressive when Doug brought the wrong wine? She's exhausting, Mom. I don't want that energy around my kids. My hands began to shake slightly, but I kept reading, even as my stomach churned and my heart pounded in my ears. This wasn't just petty complaining. This was character assassination, a full-scale takedown written in neat cursive and soaked in arrogance. I've talked to Dad, and he agrees. She's emotionally unstable. Always has been. It's not our responsibility to keep tiptoeing around her mood swings. Maybe if she spends Christmas alone for once, she'll finally learn to grow up. Let her sit by herself and stew in it. Maybe it'll finally humble her. That line. That was the one that snapped something inside me clean in two. Let her sit by herself and stew in it. Like I was some bratty child being punished. Like my isolation was some moral lesson they were delivering for my own good. The sheer audacity of it hit me so hard I had to put the paper down for a moment and catch my breath. I looked around my quiet kitchen, at the cheap pine-scented candle flickering on the counter, at the half-eaten slice of pie I'd been picking at since last night, and I realized something that stopped me cold. This wasn't sadness anymore. Not grief. Not disappointment. This was rage. Quiet, seething, calculated rage. Not the kind that made you scream into your pillow or punch a wall. No, this was the kind that made you smile while plotting. They wanted to humble me? Teach me a lesson? They wanted me to sit here and stew in my aloneness like some pathetic castaway, hoping I'd come crawling back with apologies and promises to be less of a burden? Fine. Let them think they'd succeeded. Let them think I was licking my wounds. But what they didn't know, what they never saw coming, was that I wasn't going to cry anymore. I was going to retaliate. And not with yelling or confrontation or dramatic Facebook posts. No, I was going to play this game on their level, quietly, surgically, perfectly. I read the rest of the letter through one more time, letting every syllable etch itself into memory. I would never forget the way they'd talked about me like I was some defective appliance they couldn't return. I folded it neatly, slipped it back into the envelope, and tucked it into a drawer. Not because I wanted to keep it, but because I might need it later. Evidence. Fuel. A souvenir from the moment I decided to stop being their emotional punching bag. Later that night, as the wind howled outside and snow started collecting along the edge of my windowsill, I poured myself a cup of strong coffee and pulled out my laptop. There was a holiday party coming up in my parents' neighborhood, something they hosted every year with absurd pride: white twinkling lights, catered hors d'oeuvres, and smug little cocktail conversations about community involvement. It was their social highlight of the season, their chance to show off their perfectly curated life. And just like every year, they'd submitted an RSVP weeks in advance. But this year, I decided I'd be RSVPing too. I drafted a message, polite, formal, and just ambiguous enough to raise eyebrows without pointing fingers. I signed it with their names, attached a note about their holiday donation, and mentioned a rather unusual holiday-themed performance they'd be sponsoring this year. Nothing vulgar. Nothing overtly scandalous. Just weird enough to make people whisper. Just uncomfortable enough to make them squirm. It was subtle. Petty, maybe. But it was a start. Just the first tiny pebble in what would become an avalanche. And as I hit send and leaned back in my chair, I smiled for the first time in days. Not a forced smile, not a mask for the pain, but a genuine one. Because they thought they'd pushed me into a corner. They thought they'd broken me. But all they'd really done was wake me up. There's a certain kind of satisfaction that comes from quiet revenge, the kind that doesn't require shouting, doesn't need a grand confrontation or a dramatic showdown in the driveway. No slamming doors or screaming matches, no teary-eyed apologies or begging for forgiveness. Just calm, deliberate action. Small, pointed gestures with consequences that ripple wider than anyone could anticipate. And that's exactly the kind of revenge I decided my family deserved. Not because I wanted to hurt them, although I won't lie, that idea was tempting, but because I wanted them to feel, for once, the sting of humiliation they'd so generously handed to me. I didn't want an apology. I didn't need their guilt. I wanted their perfect little world, their curated image, their self-satisfied neighborhood reputation to crack, just a little. I wanted people to whisper about them the way they whispered about me. I wanted their holiday to be memorable for all the wrong reasons. So I started with something simple, something funny, something that wouldn't point directly to me, but would absolutely make a mess. The neighborhood where my parents live is one of those pretentious suburban enclaves with a homeowners association that thinks it's running a gated kingdom instead of a street with overpriced landscaping and identical mailboxes. Every December, the HOA holds a holiday decorating contest, judged by a board of neighbors who think tinsel placement and synchronized lighting displays are high art. My parents, of course, have won for 3 years in a row. They take it seriously. Too seriously. Like they're competing in the suburban Olympics of seasonal spirit. That's when I had the idea. I logged into the HOA's website and filled out the donation form under their names, claiming they wanted to contribute to spreading joy and laughter this year by providing a full collection of novelty lawn ornaments for the block's festive showcase. I used a prepaid card, forged the email with a dummy account, and clicked submit before I could second-guess myself. Then, I contacted a couple of tacky holiday supply companies, there's a whole bizarre market for this stuff, and ordered everything from a 12-foot inflatable Santa stuck in a chimney with his pants down to a yodeling reindeer that danced when motion was detected. I included giant blinking LED candy canes, singing snowmen with glitchy voices, and my personal favorite, an inflatable toilet with a grinning elf waving from inside. The delivery instructions were precise, everything to be installed by a local setup company the morning before my parents returned from their sunny vacation. I even paid extra to have it all arranged just before the HOA judges came through for final scoring. Timing is everything when it comes to spectacle. And just to add a little seasoning to the stew, I signed my parents up for a few charming mail subscriptions, mostly medical catalogs and free trial kits for adult incontinence products, menopause supplements, and hearing aid maintenance plans. A few samples shipped immediately. A few would continue arriving weekly for the next 3 months. A little something to keep the festive spirit alive long after the decorations were boxed up. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't brag about it or even hint to Jeff, though I caught him smirking a little when I mentioned the decorating contest offhandedly. I wanted to keep it pure, just my own private joke with the universe. The best part? It worked even better than I imagined. 3 days after they got home, I started seeing the photos online. Someone from the local paper had driven through the neighborhood to feature the contest winners and ended up dedicating a whole sidebar to the most unusual display of the year, complete with a photo of my parents' front yard lit up like a carnival of absurdity. The image showed the inflatable toilet front and center, with the elf's face half deflated and slumped sideways, like it had given up on life. Behind it, the yodeling reindeer was caught mid-song, its mouth gaping open like it was screaming for help. The caption read, "A bold choice from the Simmons family this season." I nearly cried laughing. Melissa, of course, texted me in a fury, not realizing I was the architect behind the chaos. "Do you know anything about these stupid decorations at Mom and Dad's place? Someone pranked them." I replied with the most innocent lie I've ever told. "That's awful. People are so immature." I could practically hear her grinding her teeth through the screen. But I wasn't done, not even close. That had been the appetizer. The opening act. The soft prelude to a much bigger crescendo. Because Melissa was planning a big New Year's Eve party at her house, the kind of over-the-top affair she loved to host to show off her perfect family, her perfect marriage, her perfect life. There would be champagne, catered sushi, a string quartet in the foyer, and enough passive-aggressive small talk to suffocate a room. But what Melissa didn't know was that I had one more surprise coming. A quiet little time bomb, ticking away just under the surface of her celebration. It involved a voicemail, a neighbor, and a truth she'd worked very hard to bury. And, oh, it was going to be beautiful. There's a special kind of tension that floats in the air just before a bomb goes off, not the kind you hear or see coming, but the quiet kind, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up without knowing why. That was exactly the energy hanging over Melissa's house on New Year's Eve. Everything looked picture-perfect on the outside: polished floors, twinkling string lights, overpriced centerpieces arranged by some local floral boutique that probably charged more per bouquet than I spend on groceries in a week. The whole place reeked of curated wealth and try-hard perfection, just the way Melissa liked it. I hadn't been invited, of course, but that didn't matter. I didn't need to be inside the party to make sure the truth finally had its moment in the spotlight. What I'd planned didn't require my presence. It only needed good timing, a little misdirection, and just enough chaos to unravel the carefully threaded seams of their picture-perfect illusion. The setup had taken weeks. I'd recorded the key passages from that letter Melissa wrote, the same one that had shattered whatever thin thread of sisterhood we'd been pretending to hold on to. I didn't need to add anything. Her words were cruel enough on their own, laced with superiority and venom, scripted like a mean girl monologue from a bad high school drama. I trimmed the audio just enough to keep it tight and damning, her calling me emotionally unstable, mocking my existence, bragging about how she'd convinced our parents to exclude me. And most damning of all, that smug little line I could never forget: "Let her sit by herself and stew in it. Maybe it'll finally humble her." It wasn't hard to get the audio file into the right hands. A few casual conversations with a former neighbor, a shared story about how Melissa used to make fun of everyone behind their backs, a little sympathy coaxed over wine, and suddenly I had a helpful connection in the form of Susan, one of the local PTA queen bees who just so happened to be on the guest list. Susan was the kind of woman who loved drama, especially if it didn't involve her directly. And all I had to do was suggest that Melissa had been spreading nasty gossip about her daughter's school fundraiser, and suddenly she was very interested in helping me expose a little truth. People like Melissa always think they're the smartest person in the room, but they forget how easily their social throne can be pulled out from beneath them by the same people they think are beneath them. All it took was Susan slipping a small USB into the sound technician's setup. Melissa had arranged for soft background music throughout the house, jazzy, elegant, just pretentious enough to make sure everyone knew she had refined taste. But right around 9:30, as the party hit its peak and the champagne flowed freely, that USB switched tracks. The music stopped. The room fell quiet for a split second, And then, there it was. Melissa's voice, clear as day, echoing through the speakers like some twisted confession she hadn't realized she'd made public. I just think she's a black hole of energy, honestly. Everything she touches becomes dramatic. I told Mom that if we include Lori again, I'm not coming. I don't care how harsh that sounds. She's emotionally unstable, and she ruins everything. You remember last year? God, she cried over the seating chart like a lunatic. Let her sit by herself and stew in it. Maybe it'll finally humble her. The reaction was instant. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Champagne flutes paused mid-sip. A few guests exchanged awkward glances, others stared at the speakers in disbelief, and a couple even looked toward Melissa like they'd just watched her slap someone across the face in broad daylight. The silence was louder than the audio itself, and Melissa's face, according to Susan, who called me later that night, went from smug to panic-stricken in seconds. She scrambled to shut off the system, but the damage was already done. People had heard it. The kind of people she'd worked hard to impress. The kind who didn't take well to cattiness or cruelty, especially when it was served in such a public, unfiltered dose. Susan said you could feel the shift in the room, like the floor had tilted slightly under everyone's feet. I didn't celebrate with a drink or throw my fists in the air. I just sat at home with Scout curled up at my feet, watching the fire crackle and listening to the soft ticking of the clock as it crept toward midnight. It wasn't a grand victory, but it was satisfying. It was justice in a quiet, poetic sort of way, the kind of justice that tastes better because it didn't have to be loud. But just when I thought the night had reached its peak, my phone buzzed. A message from my dad. No, Happy New Year. No pleasantries. Just a simple, can we talk? I stared at it for a moment, unsure if I even wanted to respond. I debated ignoring it entirely, but curiosity won out. I called, half expecting him to lash out, to accuse me of orchestrating the whole thing. But when he answered, his voice wasn't angry, it was tired. Defeated. We need to talk, Lori, he said. I think it's time you knew everything about your mother, about Melissa, about what really happened when you were a kid. And just like that, the ground shifted again, because I suddenly realized that everything I thought I knew might only be the tip of something much, much deeper. There's something strange about hearing your parents cry, something that scrapes against the core of you in a way you can't really explain, no matter how old you are. It's unsettling, uncomfortable, almost unnatural. You grow up thinking they're the ones who are supposed to hold it all together, to never crack, to never unravel in front of you. But when it finally happens, when you see them weeping not from joy or grief, but from shame and fear that you might never look at them the same again, it does something to your heart. It doesn't necessarily soften it, but it shakes something loose. That's exactly what I saw when I walked into the house on that cold January evening. My father had asked to speak face to face, and against every screaming instinct in my body telling me to ignore him, I agreed. Part of me wanted answers. Part of me wanted to watch them squirm. But mostly, I wanted to see if they'd dare look me in the eyes after everything they'd done, after everything they'd said behind my back, and everything they let my sister orchestrate while hiding behind their forced smiles and holiday platitudes. The moment I stepped through the door, I could feel the shift in the air. Gone was the smug, self-congratulatory energy that usually buzzed through their home. Gone were the fake laughs and passive-aggressive remarks dressed up as jokes. This time, it was quiet. This time, there was no performance. My mother sat on the couch with a tissue clutched in one hand, her eyes already rimmed red and puffy, like she'd been crying for hours. My father stood awkwardly beside her, wringing his hands like he was bracing for impact. I didn't sit down immediately. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a noose tightening around their necks. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. "Lori," she said, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't sound patronizing or cold, just tired, defeated, and maybe even scared. I didn't mean for any of this to happen the way it did. I didn't think. I didn't realize how far things had gone. I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You didn't realize you planned a whole vacation without me?" You didn't realize you told people I should be alone for Christmas? You didn't realize you let Melissa tear me to shreds behind my back for years while you stood there and watched. She opened her mouth to speak again, but no words came. Instead, she broke into another fit of sobs, burying her face in her hands as if her tears could erase the damage she'd caused. My father, to his credit, didn't try to defend her. He didn't even try to justify it. He just looked at me with this weary sadness and said something I hadn't expected. "You were never the problem," he said softly. "You were never too emotional. Never too much. We didn't know how to deal with someone who saw through all of it." That hit me harder than I thought it would. Because in that moment, I realized that maybe it wasn't that they hated me, but that they feared me. Feared the way I saw through their hollow traditions, their shallow conversations, their fake smiles and fragile egos. I'd always been the one to ask the questions they didn't want to answer, the one who made things uncomfortable by simply refusing to pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Uncle Jeff joined us a few minutes later, and with his usual quiet presence, he dropped a bomb that rewrote more than just this chapter of my life. He told me stories I'd never heard before, stories about my mother's past, about family dynamics I had never been told, about how she'd always scapegoated someone, even as a child herself. He talked about patterns, about cycles, about how Melissa was just a mirror of her, a younger, shinier version carrying out the same twisted emotional games. "You were the truth teller, Lori," he said. "And in this family, truth makes people uncomfortable." I left before dinner. I didn't stay for the awkward attempts at reconciliation or the half-hearted offer to start fresh. I didn't want their apologies. I didn't want their guilt. I wanted distance. I wanted clarity. And most of all, I wanted peace, the kind that doesn't come from forced forgiveness, but from finally letting go of the idea that people who hurt you are entitled to a second chance just because they share your blood. When I got home that night, I kicked off my boots, poured myself a whiskey, and sat at my kitchen table in the soft glow of the overhead light. Scout curled up at my feet again, like he always did, a quiet, loyal shadow who never judged me for feeling too much. I let the silence settle, let it stretch out long and calm and heavy. And then I laughed, a low, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. Turns out, I said to no one in particular, maybe I was never the problem. Maybe they just couldn't handle the fact that I saw through their pretty little lies. I sat there for a while, sipping slowly, watching the snow drift outside the window in lazy spirals. And just as I was about to turn in for the night, I noticed something, an envelope tucked under my door, barely poking out from the threshold. No name on the front. Just a plain, unassuming piece of paper, sealed tight and still slightly cold from the outside air. I picked it up cautiously, heart thudding again with that strange old familiarity, like the moment before something changes, before another secret rises to the surface. Inside was a letter, handwritten, but this time not from Melissa or my parents. It was from my cousin Natalie, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who had always kept quiet in the background of family gatherings. The note was short, but the words hit like a hammer. "Thank you," it read, "for saying what the rest of us were too scared to say. You exposed what we've all carried silently for years. You weren't the only one. You just had the courage to be loud." And just beneath it, folded neatly, was another envelope, unopened. No message, no hint, just sealed and waiting. I stared at it for a long time, fingers brushing the edge of the flap, wondering what story it held inside. But for once in my life, I didn't rush to open it. Because some truths, I realized, are best uncovered in your own time.